don't treat the symptom, treat the disease. So like when someone comes in and we have this issue, it's like, oh no, like, we had this issue with this campaign. It's like, well, that's the symptom. What's the disease? The disease is way up the ladder. We launched this thing 2 weeks ago without a QA process, and we didn't have this. So it's like, I just started to see things much differently. And I think that just came with age and self-reflection.
So Seth Odell, welcome to the backstory. I'm trying to think. We first met each other, Seth, I'm guessing it was 2012. You and I were at a conference down in Florida.
Yeah.
But I had known about you before. And like, I've got your LinkedIn profile up in front of me right now. And there's some things on here that I didn't know. For instance, you were a TV producer at it looks like at a couple of stations, assignment editor.
Yeah.
But then you dove into higher ed and clearly like that entrepreneurial spirit that we see as you now being the CEO of Kanahoma, a company that you founded, started to emerge. Because I remember Higher Ed Live and all the things, but we'll get into all of that, I'm sure. But talk to us a little bit about, how did you get on the path of like media and then into higher ed, and like what were some of the things you learned early on in your career?
Sure. So I grew up in upstate New York. I went to college in upstate New York, originally at SUNY Oneonta, transferred to the College of St. Rose, small private school in the town where I was from. Got a communications major, mostly because I thought it might be easy and it didn't have that much math. And I like to talk. And so it was just sort of like I fell into it. I initially wanted to do like music business, and I think I finally wised up that that's a really tough road. And so I went into communications. The program at St. Rose was pretty great. It had like this 3-pronged approach of like PR, journalism, and then broadcast news. And so I knew like the only thing I didn't want to do was broadcast news. Like I hated those classes. It was terrible. And so, graduated on the Saturday, and on Monday I started in broadcast news because it was the only job I could find. And I was getting paid $9 an hour to be a desk assistant at a local news station, WTEN. I was, ripping scripts for anchors and running teleprompter and answering the phone. I had a brutal shift, right? I worked like 3 in the morning or 3:30 in the morning to 9:30. And then I came back in the afternoon to the evening news from 3 to 6:30. And then I worked at a coffee shop from 7 to midnight. And like just slept in like 2 shifts, and hustled my way into an assignment editor role, full-time gig, $25,000 a year salary. At the time, I thought I'd really earned it, but it turned out that nobody else wanted it. And so just kind of like stumbled in.
How did you find that out? How did you find out nobody wanted that job?
Mostly because it'd been open for like 4 months, and they were like, finally they just called me and they're like, you're like the new guy, but you're working really hard and you're trying. And I was local, so like an assignment editor's job is to like help assign stories to reporters, to follow the police scanners. And just because, I was local, my parents were local, like I actually knew a lot of folks. And so, if something was going down in a nearby town, like, my dad's friend was on the planning board or something, I could call somebody. And so even though I was kind of a kid, I was able to like, hook up some access. And so just nobody wanted it, and they gave it to me and I took it. And I did that for like a year, and I looked around and everybody in the newsroom was really depressed or divorced. And it just felt like, oh, this is like going to be a rough go if this is what I do, even though I liked the work. And so, just decided to pick up and move to LA kind of on a whim. And my ex-wife and I both wanted to live out there. She wanted to be near the beach. I wanted to be by the mountains. LA kind of had both. And I was just ready for a change. So, but I just honestly stumbled into TV news just because it was there and it was something. And that was about the only criteria I was using at the time.
So how did that propel you into higher ed? I mean, what were the synergies there?
So, when I left TV news, I really was like, okay, maybe I can translate this into PR. So was constantly trying to like trade up and like, okay, how can I leverage from here to the next thing? And so I was like, okay, I can get in from media relations into PR maybe. And so when I moved to LA, I was like, I really want to work at like Edelman. And, get into some PR firm. And, like all things in life, I thought I had a job lined up. I show up, the job's not there. I ended up working in construction. I remodeled Dr. Phil's kitchen. And I was like an assistant general contractor.
That is awesome.
And just was like, I was also working as a production assistant. I worked the groundbreaking of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel downtown with the governor, literally 12 hours after I arrived. So there was definitely like a classic like hustle mentality.
And you weren't even an actor.
No, definitely not.
Right.
And just this job came up at UCLA, and I got really like most of my things in life were a combination of like luck and privilege and a little bit of hard work. The luck was that they were hiring a media relations assistant and they really wanted somebody with TV news experience because like everybody who worked in the office was from the LA Times. And so like, hey, there was like, we should get someone from TV news to round us out. And my sister-in-law had worked at that department like previously a couple years earlier, and she knew somebody, so she was able to get me an interview. And so between that luck and privilege, landed a job at UCLA that was relatively entry level. But that's how I got into doing media relations at UCLA, was my entrance into higher ed.
Yeah. Well, right around that time, when did you start doing higher ed live? So like, I'm going to try to set up higher ed live, but I'm probably going to like mess it up. So just, edit
No
it.
worries.
But I remember that's how I was like, oh, this guy, Seth Odell, it was a video blog before there was a video blog, right? I mean, it was like you were way ahead of the time, and you had interviews. It was a whole thing. And now that I'm hearing your broadcast news, experience, I'm guessing that must have fed into it somehow, but it became a thing, right? Like, talk about that.
It did. So, the long and short story was I was working at UCLA. I had a lot of ideas, but I didn't have a lot of influence. And so I took every opportunity I could. I kind of became their videographer. My boss asked me one day, do I know Final Cut Pro? And I lied and said I did. And then like the next day I was sitting down filming The Chancellor, and like 2 weeks later I was with General Wesley Clark and then Ban Ki-moon, and like because UCLA has all these amazing people coming, and I just became the videographer. And at the same time, I'd become like the social media guy. So I set up UCLA's initial like Twitter accounts and worked with the team on their Facebook accounts and YouTube, and set up a partnership with YouTube when YouTube EDU was first coming out. So I was like hustling to do this social thing and, do this video thing, but I was still a kid. And it was a traditional bureaucratic organization. And so I felt like stuck. I kind of felt like I'm not going to get where I want to get to. And I read a great book called Crush It by Gary Vaynerchuk. I read that in 2009, and it totally changed my life. It basically talked about building your personal brand and pursuing your passions. And so I realized if I was going to get anywhere in education, like I had to like prioritize my personal brand. So, I came up with this idea. Initially, I was like, well, maybe I'll do a podcast. But then I was like, I can do like live video, and nobody else can really do that right now, because it was just Justin TV had come out and live stream, and YouTube was very early. And I just liked that stuff. And so I'd sent out a tweet that was like, hey, if I did a live weekly web show, would people watch? And a lot of people on Twitter responded and said yes. And I got a phone call from Michael Staten, who at the time was founder of Integral, which became Uversity and was acquired by TargetX. And he's like, hey, if you do this, I'll fund it. And so like I had like sponsorship like an hour and a half after tweeting about this thing.
Now you got to do it.
And credit to Tony Zanders now of Skill Type, who actually coordinated with Michael to make that happen. And so then I had to figure out how to do it. And so I basically ended up with this live weekly talk show from 2010 is when I launched till 2012. And every Sunday I'd bring on guests, and to be really transparent, because that's the goal of this show that you all have, I made a list of the 40 most influential people on social media in higher ed. And then I invited them to be my first 40 guests so I could siphon their audience to mine. And I was like, okay, I'm going to become like friends with them. And I'll be honest, looking back, it's a little cringe. But the funny thing is, like, I've made like real life friends. Like I actually like literally like, was like the officiant at someone's wedding, Mike Petroff from Harvard. Like I'm lifelong friends with like, Mallory Wilsey and Ashley Budd. And so it became this like real thing and real friendships. But at the time it was like, how can I just like become somebody? Because nobody at UCLA cares what I have to say. And so I built this live weekly web show. I brought people on. And in hindsight, we were really early. Like to be 2010 and you're bringing people on, I had to use 5 different softwares. There was no way to do this. And so I had to like literally stitch software together and figure it out. And it became a thing because it was live. And so on Sunday nights, you could come on, I'd interview someone from higher ed. You could ask questions in real time. I'd pull up the Twitter thread and we'd answer questions. And, it was like, honestly, in hindsight, it was really cool. And so I did that for 2 years, and that like really elevated my voice, gave me a chance to learn so much. So like I learned so much from everybody else. And just like it opened up so many doors. And like I still to this day, I can track my career success all the way back to higher ed live. And that is really the catalyst that changed so much for me. And so that was, I did that for 2 years until candidly I burned out. I mean, I just was like, I did over 100 episodes in 2 years. I only missed like 2 weeks the whole time. And it was just, so I flamed out and sold it to M. Stoner, who did a wonderful job stewarding it. And most people know them as the founders of it because like I was so early in it. And amazingly, it's still around today, which is just incredible. That's something that I built 12 years ago is still around and functioning in some form. So that's a little bit about higher ed live, but that is like, that's the moment and the catalyst for me in my career, I think.
Well, did you know it at the time? Like, did you know that was your moment?
No, that's such a great question. Not at all. I was so stressed. I barely even enjoyed it. And I think that's like you come on a podcast like this, and I wish I had like brilliant lessons for people, because I've been very blessed with success in my life. But I have not enjoyed nearly enough of it. And so higher ed live was like such a blur. There were some moments, there was like when we had shows with like hundreds of people watching, it was really cool. But I don't think I slowed down at all to realize like this is a big deal. And if anything, like just soak it in. You know what I mean? Like enjoy this.
Yeah.
So no, I missed it completely. And I think it took hindsight to realize the impact that it had.
I mean, Seth, when we first met, putting that together, you and Higher Ed Live, I still remember that. That was unbelievable. Was there any other opportunities that came out of that? Oh, because you were raising your personal brand, raising the level of that?
So many. So I was doing Higher Ed Live, and I was working at UCLA, and I got a different job at UCLA, a great promotion under an amazing woman, Minnie, who became a mentor for me. And I got recruited to Southern New Hampshire University because of someone I met and had on Higher Ed Live. And so wow. I would have never gone to Southern New Hampshire University, which, for people that know me, most people know me from my work at Southern New Hampshire University. Yeah. I was there for 4 years when they grew from 7,000 to 70,000 students. But I joined in 2011 when they were relatively unknown. And it was kind of a big deal for them that they got someone from UCLA, even though I was like not high up at UCLA. I only got that job because of Higher Ed Live.
And, just to kind of set the context here, because you can't undersell the work that you and the team did at Southern New Hampshire University. So I'm from New Hampshire. I grew up in Concord, New Hampshire. I actually went to middle school directly across I-93 from then New Hampshire College.
Yep.
And it was just a place that, I think people always thought, is it going to make it? Is it not going to make it? And so I remember when you went there, the perception of, when did they change from New Hampshire College to Southern New Hampshire University? Do you remember?
That's you're going to test my history. Someone's going to call me. I'm pretty sure it was in the early 2000s.
So the early
that they made
2000s.
the name change.
Yeah. And so I just remember when you went there, and I don't know why I knew you went there, but I somehow, in fact, I think that's where we met, is when you were working at SNHU. I'm like, why would he leave UCLA to go to SNHU? Like, that doesn't make, first off, you're in Los Angeles, to go to Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a lovely place, but during the middle of winter, ain't Los Angeles. I was trying to, in my head, figure it all out at the time.
It's a great question. So I think there was two things going on. One was why leave UCLA, and the other is why go to Southern New Hampshire. The why leave UCLA was that, both my ex-wife and I wanted to get graduate degrees. And we were, looking at USC and other places, and with I was like, how am I going to really spend $50,000 on a master's when I know that I work in an industry where many employers will provide it for free? And so I started to be like, maybe I should go work somewhere for just like a couple of years, get my master's, and then come back to UCLA or somewhere else if I want to. So that was why I started to be ready to leave. And UCLA had a rule that you could only get a 10% raise per year. So when I got my promotion in my third year, they couldn't even pay me the bottom of the pay range, because they said, your skills are good enough to get this job, but we can't even pay you the bottom rung of it because the state says you can only get a 10% raise. So I knew, okay, I can't stay. My growth is totally capped here. So I started to get ready to leave. For SNHU, it was purely probably the only smart thing I've ever done in my life was just, I could just see so clearly, and maybe it was my experience with Higher Ed Live and how fast the internet was evolving and social. I just knew online education was going to be huge. And while online education was poo-pooed, I got laughed at UCLA by a couple people when I left, that literally, you're going to go work in online education? That is so beneath us. And I just somehow knew that that opinion is going to fade in time, and every day we're going to move towards more and more acceptance of it. And so I think I just got lucky that I went to Southern New Hampshire, not any number of other schools that were trying to do online at the time. And that was where, again, luck plays into my career path. But I definitely was intentional about, okay, if I already have this traditional big R1 public experience, let's go get some online private experience, and let's diversify, what I know. And so just I wanted to get an online ed in 2011, and I think that's like the only smart call I've ever made, and it's definitely paid
I
dividends.
think you've made a couple of smart calls.
Yeah,
We're gonna get to those,
come on,
but,
Seth. Yeah, please.
I'm curious because I've been fascinated by SNHU for a long time. For A, being from there, and B, just seeing it explode and be this just this market force. In fact, I remember sitting out here in Seattle. And this was early when we first moved out. Maybe it was 2012. And seeing were you running national ads then? Did they show up?
I started doing national ads with them when I came in 2011. They were testing and piloting some work, and in 2012 is when we really pushed nationally aggressively.
Yeah. And I remember sitting on the couch, and I might have watched a football game. I can't remember what it was, but then there was like this SNHU commercial. I'm like, what is that? Are you kidding me? But I think there's a lot of interesting things that happen there, and I want to understand how they relate to your career. So a lot of people know Paul LeBlanc. Like, he's the president and just a force and a brilliant person and a very generous person as well. How did his leadership allow you to grow? Like, I'm assuming you didn't report directly to him, but there must have been something in the air that said, Seth, like, go do crazy things, go think outside the box.
Yeah.
Or am I misreading it?
No, you're not. So there's a couple of this. So I definitely didn't report to Paul. But Paul was the very first person I met. I walked in the front door and he was waiting and greeted me.
Wow.
I had a blog like tracking my trip cross country, and he had seen it, and so it was that was like really wonderful. So I had a relationship with Paul from the moment I walked in. Literally, he was the very first person I met at Southern New Hampshire when I showed up that day when I moved there. So Paul had hired a brilliant individual, Steve Odell, who ended up becoming a mentor of mine, to really run the online division, the College of Online and Continuing Ed. And Paul did a brilliant job of setting a bold vision and then like letting the team run. And like he's not a micromanager, and like set a big vision and let people figure out how to get there. And so Steve had a lot of autonomy to build his own team and to be focused. And Steve was really running like a business and looking at how to scale this and operationally. And so my relationship with Steve was what really transformed my opportunity at SNHU. So I never reported directly to Steve either. So I worked one rung underneath him. The kind of the short version of it on that side was that about 8 months in, I actually resigned and I was going to move back to LA. I got a job at USC. And there was a lot of reasons why the first few months at SNHU weren't great. It was just not the best environment. I had some challenges, and so it just was some folks there. They ended up, exiting some other folks, and like, long story short, was they tried to keep me. And Steve was like, "What do you want?" And I said, "I again, really, I don't know where it came from." I said, "I want 1 hour of your time every week, uninterrupted, and I set the agenda." And so I ended up getting one-on-ones with the CEO of the online division for the last 3 years, and that was where I learned everything. But that level of access was like not foreign. Like, Steve had an open cubicle office just in the middle of the floor with everybody else, walked around with flip-flops. Paul would show up and walk around any time. And the anecdote I'd share to give you a cultural idea, I'm probably best known for like the bus tour work I did. If folks aren't familiar, we drove these buses across the country and like personally delivered diplomas to online students who couldn't make it to graduation. And like, we literally did that. Like, I was literally on a bus for 46 days in 2013. But when I pitched that idea, the two people that were the most supportive were Steve and Paul. It was all their other leadership that were extremely hesitant. And I say that not to diminish the leadership. They were doing their job, but to say that, like, that seems very counterintuitive, that your biggest leaders, your CEO and the president, who the CEO reports to, are the ones who are the most green light, go, big ideas, you can't spook us with how crazy your ideas are. And they let their leadership around them be the ones that try to filter that, correct that, manage risk and mitigate and like figure out what's right to do. That was really what gave us so much runway, is that we knew that like the leadership at the top is bought in a really big way. And so that was just interesting. For the rest of my career, it's always been the boss is the most conservative, and getting to the boss is its own experience. And so it was, Paul just created an environment where we were going to push this as far as we thought we could push it. We felt like missionally that it was our obligation and opportunity. So they did a great job of setting this vision that, if students don't come to us, they might be coming to, a for-profit institution that doesn't have their best interests. And so it really felt like we were doing important work. And then they just gave us the space to do it.
How did how did that lesson in form your leadership philosophy? Because I'm guessing, you're probably 6, 7, 8 years into your career at that point. Like, what
Yep.
was starting to trigger in your brain?
So SNHU were the first time I had started managing people. I'd managed student workers before, but I hadn't managed people. I went from managing up at one point, over 10 folks and then back down to 1. I really struggled as a manager early on. And so I will say most of the lessons I got from SNHU, which, it pays dividends even today. It took time for me to understand. SNHU was a challenging chapter for me. The culture Steve created was very sports-ish, like a team. And like it was a little bit like Kobe, like anybody can call anybody out for anything if they don't think they're pushing hard enough. And so to me as a younger person, it was very aggressive culture. It was a very direct culture. But in hindsight, it was actually just a very transparent culture. And but for me, I'd never had to figure out, manage my ego. So I always felt like I was under attack all the time. And again, in hindsight, it wasn't. This was just, I was working with people 20 years older than me who were comfortable sitting in a room saying I'm not confident in the plan you've put together. And I'm not sure that you're capable of achieving this. Give me more, that. Those are tough, bold questions. But for me as a kid, I'm they're challenging me personally. It's no, they're being bold enough to share their actual feeling and concern. Don't you want that? And so SNHU was hard in that sense. The other part was I'd never been a manager. And so we were moving so fast. We were growing quickly. I had 3 jobs there. I ended up just inheriting a lot of people pretty quickly because the job I came in to do became a team of at one point 9 people doing the thing that I was doing myself 20 months earlier because we were scaling. And no one had taught me how to manage folks. And so, I don't think I was a great boss back then. I had really, really high expectations. And I made people feel bad if they didn't hit them. I was never mean, but they could just tell I was disappointed all the time. I would jump in and correct and do work, rather than respecting the time it takes to give feedback and space for someone to grow. So I was always this just do it myself, bowl through a wall. I'll stay up all night. I'll sleep at the office, mentality. And the lesson I hadn't learned then was that when you become a leader, your success is the success of your team. And so I was managing from the mindset of an individual contributor. And so I was almost resentful of my team because they kept me from all the work that I had to do. And they made it harder for me to do my work because I failed to realize that my work was their work. So SNHU taught me a lot, but I don't know that I learned a lot of them in the moment. When I left SNHU in 2015, I was pretty burned out. And I think it took some time for me to reflect back and realize how unbelievably informative that experience was.
Well, and to give you credit, reflection, I'm not a psychologist, scientist, or anything. I don't have any data in front of me. I'm just talking from self-experience. I've just found that as I've gotten older, reflection has become a more important part of my daily habit. Right. It was not when I was 25.
It's the same. I was just completely. When I moved to Utah after I left SNHU, I ended up picking up meditation and working with a therapist that was also a Kundalini yoga instructor. And I spent a lot of my life avoiding the pains of self-reflection. Rather than realizing that the way out is in, and I've learned a lot the more I've slowed down to think about those things. So it's definitely, with age comes wisdom, I suppose, in some capacities.
And I'm seeing at UCLA that spirit of entrepreneurism started to cultivate. And I wouldn't be surprised if you tell me that, hey, I was the person on the corner selling lemonade when I was a kid. I don't know if you
100%. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I booked I booked my first concert when I was 14 years old. I forged my parents' signature to rent the town hall and put on a punk concert. Raised $1,700 or $1,400, and then I gave all the money to charity because it wasn't about the hustle, or it wasn't about the money. It was about the hustle rather. And so I was totally that. I had a newsletter in middle school about mullets that I got in trouble for. I was always doing something, always 100%. And I did the lemonade stand too, actually, but that wasn't my number one go-to. But yeah, I always had some kind of racket going on.
Concert promoter at age 14. I love it.
That's awesome. Was your family like that, or were you just wired that way?
Combination of both. My mother did start and build a very successful financial firm. But when I was younger, she was taught junior college accounting at night, and my father was a state worker. So I think some of it's just in the DNA, and then some of it was at an early age I found local music and punk rock, and there's this whole DIY do it yourself mentality. So I formed bands and recorded music and put out our own CDs and demo tapes, and there's just this mentality there. So I think some of it was natural, some of it was watching my mother build a business, so that was a little bit later in life. And a lot of it was just being surrounded by this alternative music scene where everybody was doing everything themselves.
So you left Southern New Hampshire. You said you were pretty burned out, and then you actually jumped over to the to for-profit side of the house, right?
Yeah.
And started working for an agency. What drew you to? You were at Helix, right?
Yes, I was at Helix.
Yeah, what drew you to that?
What drew me was, as Jim Collins, the business author, would say, is hubris born from success. Meaning that I knew by 2015 that I had called the shot correctly on online education. And I was okay, I was right. In 2011, I came in, I got on this rocket early. I got taken off into space. My career, I was an assistant vice president now in my 20s. Huge, I'd done 30 plus commercials and 7 campaigns, managing $1 million budgets. So I'd knew that I'd called that shot correctly. And then transparently, there's a space in our industry called OPM, outsourced program management. It's where for-profit companies help manage online programs for nonprofit schools. And primarily it's built off of a revenue share model. And I, for a number of reasons, thought that was going to be a space that I could get into. I was looking for my own, payday of sorts. A lot of those organizations were offering, different kind of packages that included more than just a salary. And I was okay, if I can go into an organization and build what I've built before, maybe I can, this will be my chance to get mine kind of mentality, not the healthiest mentality. And I just called it wrong I was only there for a little less than 2 years, and it was very clear to me early that 2015 was not early for the OPM space, right? The OPM space was built in the late aughts and early teens. And by the time I showed up, most schools are trying to build it themselves or trying to get out of high rev share long-term contracts. And it was a very challenging 2 years. And it's a very good lesson that maybe I'm not going to call them every time. But that was really what it was. I thought, if I could do what I do here somewhere else, and if I can get a piece of the action, maybe I can get a bigger upside. And that didn't exactly go that way.
What did you take from that? Because if I'm reading it correctly, the business was declining, right?
Yeah,
or
it was
becoming more challenging.
It was
anyway.
It was more challenging for sure. The things that I took away from it was leadership at scale. So I was managing over 40 people at one point. I think 60 people.
Wow.
I moved into a general manager role where I was not just over creative, but I was over all of marketing services. And so that was really, really interesting. And I think I became a better manager in a lot of ways, and even self-management. And so that chapter was great for me in learning, bigger operations and scale. There was challenges with it, whether it's just layoffs or other things that are going on. I had to lead through a lot of obstacles, some of which self-created, and it was hard. But in hindsight, the scale was very significant. The volume of schools was fantastic. So obviously they worked with a portfolio of schools. And so at that time, I'd only worked with UCLA or Southern New Hampshire. When I left there, I had another 24 schools that I had worked with. And, in our space, everybody's unique, but everybody's 80% the same. And so it gave me the ability to pick up on pattern recognition from a marketing perspective. What are the strategies and tactics that work for everybody versus the ones that are unique to the institution? So I felt like I left a much more informed marketer. I felt like when I left SNHU, I thought I was a world-class creative. When I left Helix, I felt like I think I understand how marketing for online programs really meaningfully works in a substantive way. So actually tremendously informative chapter. Not personally successful or satisfying. It was just a very challenging part of my career, but learned a ton. So I think the breadth of experience, and probably the biggest lesson I would say is that if you want to learn more, do different things. So UCLA to SNHU to Helix couldn't have been more different. And so it really made me much more well-rounded, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. And was this the first time in your career? I mean, you had talked about some other challenges that you faced at UCLA, and then kind of being capped, and then at SNHU with the first 9 months being challenging. But was Helix the first time where you felt like were these just the biggest
Yeah.
challenges that you had faced in your career? I'm just trying to figure out like how did this impact you at the moment?
Sure. So I could. So it's a big question. Let me tell you the first one that came to mind. Because this is
Yeah.
a mantra that I have today. So today, obviously, I run Kanahoma, my own agency. We have a mantra that says only play winnable games, and that's what
Yeah.
informs our new business strategy. We have
Yeah.
turned down a lot of work that actually would be quite lucrative because I don't think the client's going to win. And I said, like, I don't think your
Yeah.
programs are going to work. I don't think the market's going to work for this. We had one person really ready to hire us, big budgets, would have been great. We've been hire a handful of people, but their expectations for performance weren't realistic. And so it's like, well, we can take this and drag this thing out for 12 to 24 months or longer, and then try to course correct their expectations. But I know that what they want, we can't deliver. And so we always say only play winnable games. The reason why Kanahoma is growing so well is because our clients are growing, and their clients are growing because we're picking the clients that are capable of growth. Helix taught me that, like, no matter how hard you work, if you're not playing a winnable game, you're not going to win. There was just some aspects of that work in some areas where it just felt like, I just don't think we're going to make it. Or this, whether it's a school or this program or the market, it was even bigger than the organization. That was just, it felt like we were maybe playing an unwinnable game. And like, I was trying to work as hard as I could to push through it. And it's like, there is no other side to this. So that's probably the biggest lesson, I guess, at least today, that I still use every day is only play winnable games.
I love that. Only play. We've been talking to a lot of smart people on this pod, and every episode somebody drops something. I'm like, oh, I got to go think about that next, and I'm going to think about only play winnable games. I think that is amazing.
Yeah, to me, it's the biggest thing of starting the business, which I know we'll get to in a second. Was just that like I can create the rules. These other jobs, I had all these constraints. I was playing by this. It's like I was playing somebody else's board game, and the rules had been developed, and this was my piece, and this is how I fit. And one of the attractions to studying my own shop was the fact that, like, I can create an environment where the rules are mine. And rather than try to win someone else's game, why don't I just create my own game where the odds of winning can be significantly higher?
Well, and before you started Kanahoma, I mean, there was a stop at National University and where you were the vice chancellor. So it's just for marketing. What's fascinating to me is like this ping pong thing happening in your career, right? You started on the for-profit side in broadcast news, nonprofit UCLA, I guess nonprofit SNHU, but then you went to the for-profit space and now you're back in the nonprofit. What drew you back in? Like, why did you jump back into, working for an institution like National?
So National University System was really interesting to me at the time for a few reasons. One, it was back in-house. I'd had a lot of success at Southern New Hampshire, and already, my 2 years after leaving it, I could look back and was like, wow, like that window in time was magical. And a piece of that was just that I was in-house. I could go deeper. On the agency side, it's really hard because you can't go as deep with your partners because you're just spread across a larger book of business. So I was like, okay, I can go back. I was starting to become open to going back in-house. I was open to a CMO esque role. So at National University System, I was vice chancellor of marketing, so essentially CMO. But they were also a system. So they owned and operated multiple universities, all nonprofit. They had K through 12 nonprofits, a charter school system, an online high school. So I was like, okay, like I'm going to go in-house, but I also get to work with this book of business. And I knew that I had like runway and support from them. So, I had the support from the leadership and the board to build something so we were able to build an in-house agency that at the time we called NUSA. And like literally like I was able to build out a team and structure. And again, it goes back to winnable games. It felt like this was winnable. They were facing headwinds just because the market was getting more mature, but they had a lot going in their favor. They had a strong brand, a legacy. They had substantial students, so they were large, and scale matters. I learned that during my previous chapter was just that small schools, small budgets, it's really hard to win. Bigger budgets, you just get to learn faster, and so It's not that you're better. This is the lesson from SNHU, is that you don't have to be better, you just have to learn faster, and that's the fastest path to becoming better. Like, how fast is your feedback loop? That's the question. And when you're going out and spending $1 million a week, your feedback loop is pretty fast. And that was the lesson from Southern New Hampshire, right? They could learn in a week what a smaller school with $1 million budget would take a year to learn. And so it's like, well, you're not just ahead of them now, you're ahead of them at like a rate of 50x. And like, that's how SNHU becomes, SNHU's going to start 100,000 new students this year. Like, they do that because they're learning faster than everybody else. And so I felt like, okay, National University System had a bunch of those factors. And then truthfully, it was in San Diego, and I wanted to get back to Southern California. And I was ready to try to stop moving and settle in for a while. Because this is still, it's an amazing thing about, the post-pandemic world is now you can live and work remotely almost anywhere. But at the time, if I wanted to grow my career in higher ed, probably the biggest career lesson that doesn't hold water anymore for me was, if you want to grow your career as fast as you possibly can, which was candidly totally my motivation for a long time. If you want to grow your career as fast as you possibly can, then don't restrict your opportunities to a single geography. Because like how many opportunities are coming up within 100 miles of where you live versus if you say, I'm willing to move anywhere. I mean, that's why I moved to Manchester, New Hampshire. Then I moved back to LA. Then I moved to Exeter. Then I moved back to, it's like I moved back to LA. I moved all over the place. Moved to Utah. Moved to San Diego. I did that because like this was the best job I could get from any organization in the entire country. And so one of these coming up in San Diego was like, oh my gosh, there's not that many opportunities down here. If I don't go for this one now, when's the next one coming up of this kind of size and substance? And so that was part of what pushed the leap to make that move when I did.
What did you pick up at National? I mean, were you able to expand on the stuff that you learned at SNHU?
Yeah, so absolutely did. So I was able to learn like so much. I feel like my personal leadership. So I was still meditating. I was in therapy. I think I was a little more dialed in with myself, and so I learned a lot about myself. I feel like I learned how to start to solve operational limitations in my leadership. I was always terrible at delegation, and I was able to put in a system for that and a mantra for that. So my system is, it's a twist off the Eisenhower method of either like any situation that comes up is either you do it, you don't do it, you delegate it, or you defer, meaning you're going to make a decision later on. And my biggest weakness was either that I would say I'd do it and I wouldn't get to it. So I would really be deferring it, but I'd be saying I'd do it, or I wouldn't delegate it to somebody else. And so do it, don't do it, delegate, defer. And I knew that every time someone came in my office with a situation, I had to pick one of those four. That was like, okay, that's a good system mentality for me. And it just kind of put in place that. The other one was like, if you ever have a problem at work, so someone comes in and says like, hey, we have a problem, then always the situation is essentially that either like we didn't follow the process or there isn't a process. And so it's like, did we follow the process? Yes or no? Did it work? If it's like we followed the process and it worked, we solve a problem, well, then we actually have to fix the process. Did we follow the process? It didn't work. Okay, then we need to know that. Is there no process for this? And so it became this like system mentality for me a little bit. And so that was just another piece that really kind of like, for me, it was like I started to get to this place where I could try to look at myself a little bit like a machine. I read Principles by Ray Dalio like 4 times, and systems thinking was probably the biggest personal takeaway. And that came from scale. Again, I had a huge team under me and a large budget. And I felt like I was finally finding my footing at that chapter maker. Still plenty of mistakes, but it felt like I was solving some of the systemic things. And I was getting to a place where like I was seeing things much differently. Even like, don't treat the symptom, treat the disease. So like when someone comes in and we have this issue, it's like, oh no, like, we had this issue with this campaign. It's like, well, that's the symptom. What's the disease? The disease is way up the ladder. We launched this thing 2 weeks ago without a QA process. And, we didn't have this. So it's like, I just started to see things much differently. And I think that just came with age and self-reflection. So that was for me, a empowering chapter from a managerial perspective, if that makes sense.
Have you always, you seem to have systems, Seth. Have you always had those systems, or has it just been from failure, learn, reflection, stuff like that?
So definitely didn't always. It was probably starting at Southern New Hampshire when I had that mentor, Steve Hodel, who's still a mentor today. He started to recommend a lot of books. So he introduced me to Jim Collins, and so I read like as much Jim Collins as I could, Good to Great, How the Mighty Fall, and Built to Last. And so it was probably at SNHU, I read everything I could get my hands on. So I was churning through 40, 50 books a year pretty easily. Plus I was reading tons of blog posts. And so it started there with like this, just like trying to learn through it, and then trying to talk through what was happening. So like even like in my therapy in San Diego, I would have a problem at work, a frustration with someone, or I felt like I'd like literally go to therapy. I'm mad, right? I'm mad about this. So I couldn't believe this happened. And I would like work through it and try to figure out what was it, what happened, how can I solve for it. So it evolved over time, but it was not something that came naturally. It came from me consuming other people's information and realizing like I could shortcut my way to being more effective if I just listened to people smarter than me and then applied the things that they're recommending and seeing how they work. So like, truthfully, most of the books I've read, I can go back to like one or two things, but like, even like on my shelf, I have a few hundred books, but like Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, she's this like world-class poker player, but she talks all about how every decision is a bet, and that there is luck in life, and that like you can't judge success based on the outcome. This was like blew my mind, that you can't judge the success of your decision-making based on the outcome of your decision-making. You have to judge your success based on your ability to assess the information you had at the time. Because every once in a while, even though you have a 90% chance of winning, you still lose. Right. What was the right decision? And like that was an example. I read that book and that totally changed the way I thought about marketing. I used to think like if it didn't work in marketing, then it was a failure. And it's like, well, no, was that the right decision with the information you had? And then I would just start to see things differently. Even like marketing's job is not to do the right thing, it's to get you one step closer. So like at Southern New Hampshire, I worked with a guy, Steve Canarian, who talked about, he was the head of data. He talked about where there's smoke, there's fire. And he's like, when you do marketing, it's not your job to get to the right answer. There is no truth. Your job is to get more information so the next decision you make is more informed than the last one. So that's the only job of data, is to make every future decision more informed than the last. And I was like, oh, that's so liberating. I used to think you had to like analyze the data until it perfectly told you this is what happened. And he's like, no, that's not it. It's just to make a smarter decision. So data informed, not data driven. So lessons like that were from a combination of like books, podcasts, and then great people around me that were smarter than me that put up with a lot of my questions, and then applying it and self-reflecting. Somewhere in there was a system where it felt like I started to see things that way. And now, like for the poor people that work with me, they hear me say all those same, they've heard don't play, only play winnable games probably 500 times in the past year. But now I'm in a rhythm where I do think like a system is emerging organically, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so we've covered a lot of ground, and now let's like dig into Kanahoma, because you clearly like so much development was happening along the way. And thank you for being like just incredibly transparent about it. In full disclosure, when you started Kanahoma, I reached out. I was like, hey, we got this problem to solve. And we worked with you, and you were absolutely like, you and your team were amazing. Talk about like how you formed that business, and like what was it like? Because you're what, 2.5, 3 years in now?
Yeah, we're 2 years and 3 months. So yeah.
2 years and 3 months.
November 2020. So I knew for some time that I thought I wanted to do my own thing. The real answer is I have always said that I want to take this as far as it can go. And this meaning my career, my work, I don't really know. I've always said I want to take this as far as it can go. So at one point I was like, well, now that I'm vice chancellor, like, do I become a college president? And I actually participated in some college presidential searches and had some interviews. And I was like, I don't want to be a college president. Like, that's just not my vibe. I don't want to have to cover the tattoos and be the politician that comes with that. And I respect people that can do that role. This is not my cup of tea. And so I was like, well, what's next? It's like, well, I'm going to become a CMO somewhere else, or otherwise, like, that's it. I've hit a ceiling and I'm just going to be a CMO for the rest of my career. And at the time I was, in my early 30s when I took that job. So it's like, that's it. I'm just going to do this for 20 or 30 years. And so to me, then it was like, I think I might want to build my own thing and, run my own company. My thesis was that, industry expertise was invaluable from an agency perspective, but I felt the majority of the agencies in the space that I'd worked with were just a little subpar. The teams they built didn't actually have the experience, even if the founder did. And I didn't know that they delivered. So it's kind of like, I just think there's room and market for a new, fresh entrant, especially one that leans on the non-traditional online side. And so I kind of just put that out in the universe, I guess. I made a vision board, which is hanging in my office, and, thought about that. And then I got approached by UCLA, and through a long story, making it short, I got a long extended contract with them to be like my first consulting client. And so, my wife was like, well, if you're really going to do this, you don't turn down UCLA, a chance to go back to an institution that you were part of. to work on that side. So I spent, 9 or 10 months with UCLA consulting, and that's what gave me the confidence to like leave a very like high level executive job that obviously like, I have bills and mortgage payments and other things. And so that was my like transition off was, okay, I have a consulting relationship lined up with, the most popular university in the history of education. And I made that move. But when I started, I didn't know, am I building an agency or a consulting company? My first few clients were consulting. And so first I was like, am I going to even make enough money to pay the bills? Or, am I going to have to like liquidate my retirement to cover stuff? And I was really like nervous relatively early on in the first 3 or 4 months. I was like, okay, like I can make money as like doing consulting. But what I really wanted to do was build an agency. I felt like, an agency model was more exciting to me. The scale of impact was better. And transparently, I was just really scared that as long as I run a consulting company, I'm selling my time. And that means that like the only way for me to make money is to work more. And I'd like to make a good living and provide for my family, but I'd like to be around for my family too. And so I knew I really wanted to make the agency side of it work. So even at one point early on, I had sold like 40 hours of consulting so far a week. And I was doing that, and I got approached by someone about being a part-time CEO of an ed tech company and stepping in, and like maybe you could do it at 20, 30 hours. And it would have been unbelievable money, like way more money than I've ever made in my entire life when you combine. I'm like, my wife and I sat down, like, this is crazy, right? Like I left this job 4 months ago and I'm going to make like 2 or 3 times what I was making. But I turned it down because when my wife and I were talking about it, it was just like, if I do this, I'm not starting an agency. I'm selling my time, and now I got to go work 70 hours a week. And for what? Like, do I really is money really the motivator here? And so turn that down, and like literally like the next week, a client came and wanted agency services, and I scaled up and hired and kind of have been moving into the agency model ever since. And so when I started, it was wandering. I knew I wanted to do my own thing, but I didn't know what it was. And so either it was poor planning, or on the flip side, I'd say that my whole career, I have let opportunity dictate what I do and where I go. So like Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs says, don't pursue your passion, pursue opportunity, and like bring your passion with you, meaning like become passionate about the opportunities that are provided and presented. I didn't want to work in TV news, but I took the TV news gig. I didn't know UCLA was going to be what happened when I got to LA. I made the most of it. The whole way across my career, it's been the case. So even with Kanahoma, when I started Kanahoma, I knew I wanted an agency, but I was just going to let this thing become whatever the market told me it wanted. And thankfully, it's wanted what I wanted to build, which is an agency model. It just took a little bit of time out of the gate to kind of find that footing.
And now, 2023, how many people work at Kanahoma?
So we have 26 full-time employees. We just onboarded 2 more this morning. Employees 25 and 26 started today. So yeah, we're averaging an employee a month at this point.
Wow. So it's really incredible growth for you personally. What has that meant?
So on one hand, it's felt like a huge achievement. Like I've built a big company that has 26 employees. That's been amazing. I'll tell you the things I loved. I've felt like I've been able to build the company I want to build in some ways. We have great benefits. We pay for 100% of health insurance premium for employees, spouses, dependents, a 401k with a 4% match. We have the best health plan offered from Blue Shield, like nationwide. Like we go all out. Excuse me. We priced it that way from the beginning. I want to be a good employer. Our lawyers were like, oh, you can take your 4% match on the 401k and lock it up for 2 or 3 years. That way people leave, they lose that piece of the retirement. I was like, no, give it to them day one. Like they vest right away. I removed mandatory arbitration agreements. Like I really like, I grew up in a liberal pro-labor family, and it's been really cool to feel like maybe I can try to be a better boss and build a better business. I don't know that I'm always successful in that. In fact, I know that I'm not. But when I look back, like that's been really satisfying. Also really satisfying has been working with great partners. We have some incredible clients that really are like really appreciative. One of the things I forgot about was, when you're in-house, it's sort of this, it's a little bit like an arranged marriage in some capacities. But when someone hires you on the outside, they have to already clear the hurdle of like truly having a respect and appreciation for your skills and acumen, because they could choose you or other people. And so these relationships are built on like, mutual appreciation and respect. And so the majority of them are quite satisfying to like help good people win. and then to see them grateful for it. So the challenges have been, I'm working around the clock. I was not sleeping, working nights, weekends. I had health scares because I wasn't resting enough. I ended up in the ER. A lot of that, not to oversimplify, was because I was too scared to scale the business. And so when I started, we were project-based work. I've migrated almost all of it into retainer work. But even still, it's like, I've been nervous, like, well, what happens if the clients leave and if other clients don't come? And so because of that, I hoarded cash. And the cash is in the business, and that's great in a recession to have it. And so I think we're in a good position. But like, I wish I could go back and make less money the last 2 years and have hired sooner and have slept at night and gotten out of the way and gotten myself out of the process. But that was just fear. It was totally a fear mentality, and not just fear for me, but like, I'm hiring people now and they're expecting jobs to come up. And, my contracts expire at the end of fiscal years and people have to choose if they want to re-up or not. And I'm responsible for providing opportunity to people that are providing for their own families. And so I have gotten my sea legs under me in many ways 2 years in, but that was the hardest part. So I overworked myself simply because even though I had the resources, I was too scared to deploy them. And so I thought, I'll just do all this work so that way, if the weather shifts and gets worse, I can, like, we'll be okay. And in hindsight, it's like, well, you overworked yourself, so you're not okay anyway. So it was just, that's probably the biggest flub on my part. And we did take a couple clients we shouldn't have worked with and some small project-based stuff that we didn't, but like, those lessons are small. We just learned that. The biggest lesson was like resource allocation and getting out of the business. Like, you don't hire great people and then look over their shoulder. And I think I did that for a good chunk of our tenure so far, just out of insecurity and nervousness related to scaling and maintaining revenue.
Seth, I want to be respectful of your time. You've given us a lot of information to process. And, as we close the pod, you've had a heck of a journey. Like, your path has been really cool, not just geographically bouncing around the country, but just, the twists and turns that you take and the lessons that you've learned. But, you strike me as a very reflective person at this point in your life, right?
Yeah.
As we all age, we get more reflective. If you could walk the same path again, would you, or would you take a different path?
So, I would walk the same path completely. I think all the bumps and bruises and lessons I needed to learn, I'd love to learn them sooner because I think we're all a little impatient, but no, I wouldn't change any of it. I feel extremely blessed and extremely lucky and privileged. Like, the life I have is great. I have a wonderful team. I have an incredible partner and a great, healthy, crazy 2-year-old daughter. No, I have no complaints about life at all. If I slow down, pieces in the present, and it's all there for me. So I definitely wouldn't change a thing.
Right. Seth, where can people learn more about you? Where do you want to send them?
So if they want to learn more about the company I run, it's Kanahoma.com, Kanahoma.com. But otherwise, I'm Seth Odell pretty much everywhere. So on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Twitter and LinkedIn are probably the two places I'm most active, so find me there. But people can reach out. I also have a newsletter. If you go to Kanahoma.com, it's a weekly newsletter they put out. So any of those totally work. If you're only going to do one, I'd say, connect with me on LinkedIn. I tend to use that as a good resource, so I'd love to have you in the network.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Well,
Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, Seth Odell, thank you so much. And, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you both for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Leadership Backstory. Make sure to subscribe from your favorite podcast player and leave us a review if you like what you hear. We appreciate you sharing your feedback with other listeners. Peter Barron and Brendan Schneider host The Leadership Backstory. Catch you on the next episode.